You're listening to
Reverb,
a podcast
about politics,
culture,
and language in action.
I'm Calvin Pollock.
And I'm Alex Helberg.
Folks, Reverb is a show about social and political issues as seen through the lens of rhetorical analysis, exploring both how language works on us and how we can work with language. It's also a direct descendant of The Silver Tongue, a blog maintained by CMU English students from 2010 through 2016, which bore the slogan, Rhetorical Criticism for the Engaged Citizen.
And here in our inaugural episode, we're sharing our interview with one of the co-founders of The Silver Tongue, Doug Cloud, an assistant professor of English at Colorado State University, in which we address what our definition of rhetoric should be, the connections between rhetoric and public decision-making, and the value of exploring big questions in the humanities through a variety of case studies and contexts. We're talking today with Doug Cloud, an assistant professor of English at Colorado State University, and one of the founding editors of The Silver Tongue's a blog dedicated to providing, quote, rhetorical criticism for the engaged citizen, and the spiritual predecessor of Reverb. Doug, welcome to Reverb. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
So I wanted to just kind of get into, again, since you are one of the sort of founding editors of the Silver Tongue, of the blog, specifically as it was relating to rhetoric. Again, the sort of the tagline or the motto of the site was rhetorical criticism for the engaged citizen. I thought we might start from kind of a definitional point. And I know that it's a bit of a cliche in the circles that we run in to ask a question like this, but how would you yourself define rhetoric? Why is it important as a discipline of study, or as something that we even just something that we do in everyday life? And why do you feel that it's important to bring knowledge of rhetoric into the public?
Oh boy, gosh, I remember in graduate school when what is rhetoric was a question that everyone dreaded. It was kind of like the ultimate jerk move that you could do would be to ask someone that question.
Yes, and that is the card that I've decided to play.
That's fine by me. I think no answer is going to get it done in less than an hour.
Sure.
You have to start from there.
Mm-hmm.
But since we're talking about rhetorical scholarship that is designed to in some way be intelligible and useful to the public, I think it's okay to start with a very general definition, which is rhetoric is language that gets things done in the world. It's the use of language by humans to achieve an effect, or to try to. Obviously, we still look at language that tries and fails. And then you can add another layer onto that. You can add a normative layer onto rhetoric, and you can say, well, good rhetoric gives reasons that are supported by evidence. It doesn't set out to deceive. It tries to achieve mutual understanding rather than just getting people to do what you want. Now, when I define rhetoric for undergraduate students, I often say that it's the only known alternative to force.
Right.
If you want to influence people, you can hit them, or you can persuade them, and those are really the only two choices that we know of so far, although of course that's an oversimplification.
Mm-hmm.
Now, for scholars, we have thornier questions like,
right.
If for something to be rhetorical, does that mean that it is translatable into a proposition supported by reason, supported by evidence, or can rhetoric be something that is more diffuse or harder to restate as just alphabetic language? Does rhetoric have to be intentional, or can it happen unintentionally? What about things like buildings and rooms and algorithms? Can these things argue? And if we say that everything is rhetorical, which people do,
right,
are we diminishing the usefulness of the term? If everything is rhetoric, then nothing is. I mean, it has to, in order for it to be I sound like Saussure here, in order for it to have any meaning, it has to be, some things have to be it and other things have to not be it. But I think it's fair to say that most, if not all, human communication has a rhetorical element. It seeks some change in an audience's thinking or action. It may do other things too.
Yeah, I think that's a great definitional kind of baseline to start from, and I like that you were drawing on the kind of the Perlmanian and Obrecht, or I guess I shouldn't say, the Perlman and Obrecht's Titeka sort of distinguishing of rhetoric as being an alternative to force. That this is something that's I think it's really productive to look to think about rhetoric in terms of the ways that it's can provide a sort of productive change, or that it can lead to action that is in a way that is not coercive, that uses again sort of like reasoning in order to get to that. And at the same time, I find myself kind of stuck between those debates too about what is and what is not rhetoric, because a lot of times we can sort of when you get to thinking about like like you said a building, or even things out in public like benches or the streets, the ways that things are designed in the world kind of impel you to interact with them in a certain way. Do we consider that persuasion? I think that it's these are interesting questions to ask, but
and if we're talking to a public audience, I think it's really helpful to, if we're defining rhetoric, I think it's really helpful to start with the idea that people have that rhetoric is dirty language,
right.
That it's persuasive language that is gross in some way or slimy. That's definitely not the way I define it. And if we're going to get into things like can buildings argue, it's very useful to have an easy example, and I'll give you one.
Sure.
When the Nazis appropriated Greco-Roman architecture, one of the things they did was to scale it up dramatically. And you can see this in contemporary shots of North Korea, so that you have these enormous buildings, these enormous squares. And one of the things they do rhetorically is they remind human individuals how small they are in relation to the state.
Right.
So that would be an example of how a thing like a building or architecture could argue.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's a really fascinating and a great example to kind of start us out with. Thank you.
Yeah, so Doug, in terms of this public-oriented view of defining rhetoric and making rhetoric useful for the public, what was kind of your you and the other founding members of the Silver Tongue, what was your impetus for starting it, and did it relate to that idea of opposing the common sense view that rhetoric is everything bad that your political opponent has to say?
Well, I think in our more grandiose moments, we imagined that there could be a public out there that was interested in language research of the kind we wanted to do,
Right.
which was a very easy, understandable analysis of public discourse, something that where we would take something that people are hearing in their everyday lives, whether it was political or whether it was a sign that they're seeing in their community or whether it was something that had gone viral and was showing up in their Facebook feed, and get them to look at it in a different way.
Right.
We saw that, or at least I did, as an intrinsically useful exercise, that human beings are better human beings when they look at things more deeply, when they can look at things in more than one way. We weren't sure that there was a public out there at all. We hoped and fantasized that there was. But if you think there might be an audience, or that there should be an audience, I'm inclined to say that you should go for it. You should try to call an audience like that into being, as Michael Warner would say, run it up the flagpole and see who salutes.
Right.
Put on a show and see who shows up. Mostly, we just liked talking about current public discourse in a deeper way that doesn't really make it into peer-reviewed scholarship, or it doesn't make it into scholarship fast enough for it to make a difference in practice. I was personally doing a lot of scholarly writing at the time. I was writing my dissertation. I was writing exam. At that time, I was writing my exam proposal, and I felt like I had lost my voice a little bit. I still feel that way because I have to do so much academic writing.
Yeah.
And it was very liberating to write in a way that somebody like my dad would want to pick it up and read it, and to be able to get a little sassy, to be a little arch. You don't get to do that in scholarly discourse, or only some people can get away with it.
Right. Yeah. No, I think that's I'm really glad that you brought that point up too about, again, this being, not only a means of, engaging a public or sort of calling a public in the way that, a theorist like Michael Warner talks about, but also being a way to, make scholarly work translatable, and make what we do more accessible to the public as well, because and for all the concerns that you mentioned specifically of current events not being quickly translatable into scholarship, because peer review takes time, and writing a lot of robust research takes time, but that doesn't mean that's the scholarly lenses that we're developing or the tools that we use can't or shouldn't be applied to things that are happening kind of in the moment, as they happen. Yeah. So I was wondering also if we could talk a little bit more about on that notion of who the public is that you think you're or that we sort of want to be addressing here. So as I stated earlier, the original motto of the Silver Tongue was rhetorical criticism for the engaged citizen. Could you say a little bit more about specifically what that means, particularly focusing on the term engaged? What does it mean, do you think, for us to be engaged as citizens? What does rhetoric have to do with this concept of engagement? And as a auxiliary question, has your definition of engagement changed from when you started the blog originally to this current moment?
I think we used engagement in a pretty simple way. We did not think deeply or theoretically about that as a modifier for citizen. Engagement is a key term in higher education that refers to the connections between scholarship and community. So it's come to mean that more for me as I have moved on in my career, but we just meant people who want to ask questions. So people who might encounter the news about President Trump makes a statement and the claim is that statement is racist. And so an engaged citizen is going to care, and they're going to agree or disagree, but they're not going to stop there. They're going to want to say, well, why exactly is it or isn't it? What are our criteria for deeming a statement racist? To me, the ideal citizen encounters a problem or a controversy or a choice, really, and instead of having a knee-jerk reaction, this is my opinion, this is my view, and let me defend it as loudly as I can, they ask, what are the arguments on either side? There's a sense of kind of calm curiosity about it. Obviously, that's not always possible, particularly with issues of justice and threat, that sometimes anger is a very warranted reaction. But wherever possible, the engaged citizen says, okay, but what else does this tell us? What they want to keep going. They want to keep asking questions.
Yeah, so I mean, one thing that occurs to me when you give that description of the ideal citizen, and I don't know if we were gonna go to this kind of like devil's advocate position later in the interview, but what interests me about that formulation is that I think a lot of theorists or commentators would say that kind of position correlates with privilege, right? The idea that you can calmly analyze arguments on all sides of an issue and come to this kind of reasonable position, and I'm not necessarily defending that position, but I'd be curious how you would address that. The idea that your material circumstances relate to your ability to sit there and weigh all of the possible reasons and come to this kind of nuanced perspective.
The critique that you're giving voice to is a critique that was often leveled by feminists against the practice of Rogerian rhetoric. So Richard Young, who founded the rhetoric program in which you're both matriculating, proposed a kind of argument that tried to remove face threat, right? Tried to achieve mutual understanding. You were supposed to find points of commonality between you and your opponent to demonstrate that you've understood their position. And their point was that for a group that might be oppressed, that means that the oppressed group has a lot more to lose from that stance than the dominant group, because they have to acknowledge the validity of the point of view of their oppressors. So, as a queer person, am I really going to say to somebody who's, boy, I see why you want to put all gay people on an island and then nuke it, but let me try and dissuade you from that point of view. So there are certainly instances in which it really doesn't make a lot of sense to respond that way pragmatically.
Yeah.
And I think there's an argument to be made, and it's a good one, that calmness is a kind of backhanded critique of rhetorical practices that don't fit with a Western rational critical model. That there are practices like testifying or calling out or I don't, we could probably name a lot of them that involve strong emotion, and that by attributing calmness to the ideal citizen, I'm expressing a negative viewpoint towards those practices. Yeah, boy, that's a tough critique to respond to in a lot of ways. I think that tension has to persist.
Right.
I think we have to say, is that coming from a position of privilege? And the answer is usually yes. Does that mean that that perspective is totally valueless? I hope not. I strive toward, let me just say that I strive to be a person who, one of the things I study is anti-gay arguments, anti-trans arguments. And sometimes when I'm looking at that data, it really gets my hackles up, right? It gets my blood boiling. I like getting to the point where I'm able to look at it and say, here's what's wrong with this, other than just that I think it's gross.
Mm-hmm. And to appeal to certain standards to make those points, standards of good argument and good deliberative practice.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I think I'm on board with there being many different kinds of good argument, many different kinds of good citizens. So calm probably wasn't the best word.
And Doug, I really wasn't meaning to play like a gotcha there, but it got to something that we definitely wanted to touch on with you, given your expertise in public sphere theory and stuff like that. And so maybe we should go to the quote next.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I also wanted to say, because I think it sounds like what we're moving towards. I'm just trying to kind of synthesize where we've gone in the conversation so far. Is that we're, again, as you said earlier, Doug, about one of the original sort of founding ideals of something like the Silver Tongue was to take a concept or an entire field such as rhetoric, that a lot of people would have this sort of knee-jerk reaction of like, oh, well, that's BS, that's just BS, or that's bad language.
From online posts to rhetoric from elected officials.
Well, that is not what happens in these cases, and using that kind of scare rhetoric is just terribly unfortunate.
That's the difference between rhetoric and reality. What Tim Cook is putting out is rhetoric, and what the investors are seeing is reality. Now, you have to know the
macro issue of politics, though, is still very much prevalent, especially talking about the shootings. Who's to blame? Is the heated political rhetoric part of the blame?
The APC government's campaign, rallying cry to restore security, rebalance the economy, and fight corruption was not all rhetoric.
We're also going to get treated to more divisive rhetoric from a desperate campaigner-in-chief. It's shameful for a president to use the State of the Union to divide our nation.
The head of the Boy Scouts of America apologized to members of the organization on Thursday for the political rhetoric that was inserted into its national gathering this week by President Trump.
Our great nation is teetering on the brink of political and cultural anarchy, and the blame lies with Hollywood and public universities and the far left. The hateful rhetoric has given birth to bloodshed.
Amnesty International said President Donald Trump's, quote, poisonous rhetoric is leading what Amnesty calls a global trend towards more divisive politics and has made the world a, quote, darker place.
Obama runs the presidency as if his main job, his only job, is rhetorical and political. Shore up the base, make speeches. It's all rhetoric. He's got a crisis of management.
I think the other what we're going towards now, or what this last sort of little interchange is sort of illustrated too, is this other notion that people have when I for example, when I tell people around a holiday dinner table that I study rhetoric, the other one is I should watch my grammar around this person. I should watch my sort of standard of correctness in terms of how rational I'm being in my own sort of like linguistic practices. And I think that that opens up this whole other dimension of rhetoric as this kind of that it's this kind of situated practice. It's not just purely a sort of normative standard for what counts as good argument or good deliberative practices, but that these are kind of situated within the communities that they occur with, the people that are in them as well. And so to that end, there was a quote that Calvin and I know that we'd shared this with you in the document beforehand, but this was an interview that you gave back in 2014 with the English department at CSU, where you talked about the importance of studying English rhetoric and such in our society, in which you said, quote, "I think the most of the problems facing humanity are not technical. That is, we don't face many issues that we can't find technological solutions to. Our weakness isn't finding solutions to problems, but getting everyone to agree on a single or a set of solutions. We aren't really good at shared decision-making because we live in a society where face-to-face communication is impractical. We can't get everyone in a town hall meeting to agree on a course of action. It's hard to solve the global issues facing humanity because we don't see the consequences of our shared decision-making, which often have far-reaching but unforeseen implications. People are more alike than we are different. And by studying the humanities, we attempt to reconcile our values and our actions and tackle the ideological problems of our society and our world." So I was wondering if you could expand specifically on some of the things that you mentioned in that quote, such as, shared decision-making, because that's probably something that not a lot of people would associate with rhetoric, or at least, members of the public might not associate with rhetoric upon first hearing it. So what exactly is it that a rhetorical perspective or an English and humanities oriented perspective contributes to this sort of deliberative processes like shared decision making, or again coming to terms with some of the implications of the ways that we argue about issues?
You can be in a field so long, and I haven't been in this field for that long. I'm not really that old.
Yeah.
But you could be in it long enough to forget that people don't associate rhetoric with decision making.
Yeah.
I remember hearing for the first time the idea of rhetoric as inquiry and being just totally befuddled by that idea.
Yeah.
Because I saw it I saw the starting point of rhetoric as you have a proposition, you have an argument, and you're going to make it. And hopefully you're going to make it well, and hopefully you're going to make it ethically.
Right.
What I didn't understand, but I think that I'm beginning to understand now, is that rhetoric is also a factor in how we reach conclusions and decisions. So you take a small group of people who are trying to figure out a course of action, and if they're operating out of a consensus-driven model, they're going to have to agree on a single course of action. It's going to take rhetoric to get there, hopefully, in a really good deliberative interaction where we say, well, here's an option, what are the positive and negative, what are the trade-offs, what are the advantages here of different courses of action? That's rhetoric. That's rhetoric as inquiry, using those practices to evaluate possibilities. I think that's partly how I see rhetoric entering deliberation. The other place I see it is in our heads, which gets back to your earlier points and questions. I think studying rhetoric makes people better people, if and especially if they learn the art of self-deliberation, which is I have a thought, and I think, now what would be an alternative to that thought, and now why do I think that, and how would I justify that to a particular audience? That we're kind of always going through that process. I think that makes people more thoughtful, but that's just my view.
Do you think it's harder in this day and age to engage in that kind of like metacognition where you put a position out there, maybe in your own head, and you think about it, and you think about alternative positions and kind of go through this dialogic process on your own? Is that harder in a day and age when it's so tempting to just post your position, and it kind of takes on this objectified quality where that's your position, and it even though everything is very ephemeral on the internet and in today's like technologized culture, it also our positions seem to have a more like final quality seemingly when we post them, for instance.
Do you mean that if we take a position on something publicly, it's very face-threatening and embarrassing to change it later?
I think that's part of what I'm asking about. Yeah.
Particularly with online discourse, that seems to be kind of a, well, and maybe that's just because online spaces are not really designed to be great deliberative spaces, because they record positions such that they're there forever, and it's hard to modify something without I'm thinking on Twitter, without somebody like quote tweeting you. It's like, well, remember when you said this back in back in 2009 or whatever. I don't know. Is it more difficult to do something like that in an age where, at least online, the spaces in which we engage with the other people or talk about politics or talk about these pressing issues aren't really in a sense designed to encourage that kind of rhetorical thinking? Maybe
I want to say that there are a lot of people making a fair amount of money on pop psychology books that claim that this or that internet practice are making us stupid or inattentive or shortening our attention spans, or we're addicted to this or that. So those points have all been made.
Of course.
I think we can say for sure that it's difficult to engage in rich thought if you don't have the space to do it in. And by that I mean the quiet and time by yourself, even just a little bit of it, apart from, think of all these moments when you're picking up you're waiting in the doctor's office, so you're reading the news on your phone, you have 4 minutes before somebody meets you at a restaurant, right? And so you're looking at your phone. Your friend goes to the bathroom while you're having dinner with them in a restaurant, and you pull out your phone while they're away.
Right.
And like all these interstitial moments, what did people do with them before? I don't really know. I can't remember.
Yeah.
So in that sense, maybe. But when have we ever, I mean, do we really want to fantasize about a past that may or may not have existed, in which people were walking around like Socrates, reasoning about this or that, and interrogating their beliefs through the Elenchus, through, and asking themselves difficult questions?
That's a really good point, yeah.
I don't believe that people have changed, can change so radically in a generation that we could get stupid or get meaner or angrier or something. I just don't buy it. I think our capacity for those kinds of activities is probably the same as it ever was. The question is just, are we doing it?
Yeah, that's a really great point, and I'm glad you offered a kind of a corrective to the, again, like you said, pop psychology books. I'm thinking a lot of like the Nicholas Carr in The Shallows is making those kinds of arguments about how what the internet is doing to our brains, and other pop media theorists who have done that kind of work.
At the same time, it's hard to, I mean, at least for me as someone who and probably all three of us here in this conversation, like, we're all digital natives to one extent or another, and it's like, how can that massive material change not influence our rhetoric, the rhetoric of our generation?
How could it not? I mean, how could it not? I mean, you're absolutely right. And in invoking that, the pop psychology stuff, I don't disagree with it. Well, the good stuff,
there's a variation, right?
But after a while, it gets kind of obnoxious to hear over and over that social media or the available of information is making us stupid, or some other thing. Right. And I get to the point where I want to say, well, what would you suggest?
Sure. Yeah, good point. Yeah, that we divest from all technology, that we burn our smartphones in a massive fire, and that we go back to reading books, I guess. I don't know.
Yeah, but there are more and less. There are variants and degrees of disengagement from the most toxic forms of online communication and discourse.
That's a good point. Yeah.
There are certainly healthy habits that we can cultivate. Things like, again, leaving technology, limiting our own access to it in a disciplined way. Taking our work email off of our phones.
Yeah, that's a good. That's one that I need to do. Yeah.
Yeah, that makes a big difference in your mental life. I do a lot of that kind of thinking while I am jogging.
Yeah.
That's very hard to read a smartphone when you're jogging. I mean, I've seen people do it.
I've seen people do it too. Yeah, it's hilarious.
But it also,
I've seen people do it while they're biking.
Oh, gee.
Very alarming.
Oh God.
Yeah, that almost becomes a public safety hazard at that point. But in addition to not great mental practice in terms of mindfulness and everything. But yeah.
So Doug, before we let you go, we wanted to just ask you to update us on what you're researching right now, and what brought you to study the things that you're studying right now.
Well, my research is a little bit unusual in that while I have a consistent focus on a set of problems, how do we figure out who other people are in discourse, and how do we change our understandings of who other people are in discourse? So you take an identity category or a label and look at how it gets revised over time, is one of the things I do. But I do it in lots of different places. So I study queer rights rhetoric. I study the rhetoric surrounding atheism and atheists and how they are defining themselves. I find that a very fascinating area of inquiry. And then most oddly of all, I also have a branch of research in climate change communication, particularly because the thesis that has been advanced there by a number of prominent voices is that the reason we can't get people to agree is that it's become a tribal issue. It's about our identity rather than the science. So there's all these intractable problems floating around me. One is, how do you let go of the fantasy of a logos-only discussion of a scientific issue and look for positive roles for ethos and pathos in those discussions. So if identity and who we are and tribalism have infected it, what do we do then? A big concern for me right now, I have one project out on it and one project in process, is this question of human rights arguments that depend on low agency claims. I was born this way, I can't change, I can't help it.
Right.
Those should be familiar to people from mostly from the gay rights movement. And so I am trying to imagine what the alternatives to that might look like, because there are so many problems with that approach. So as a whole, looking at issues of identity and identities in public discourse, stigma, public discourse, how marginalized groups get represented. But I do it in different areas. Areas so different, everybody raises their eyebrow when I talk about my research.
Yeah. It kind of seems though that a lot of that, like, you know, there are you know, the locus of a lot of your research does circulate around these issues of, you know, identity and the function that plays in arguments, you know, whether we're talking about, you know, LGBT rights or arguments surrounding climate change, like you said, that's ended up being so kind of tribalistic and centered around identity, as well, yeah, like atheist discourse too, which is very, you know, which I would imagine is fairly rooted in, you know, sort of identification of yourself, you know, as with one thing or against another, as well.
It sure does. The reason I went into studying atheism was partly because I'm an atheist and I was curious about how people talk about it, but also partly because it's I think in order to understand a linguistic phenomena, you've got to look at it in different domains. It's not enough to look at something in just queer rights. You've got to see if what you're talking about holds true elsewhere. And there hasn't been a lot of discussion in rhetorical scholarship about atheists as a category of people.
Right.
And what has been done has been a lot of it kind of, I guess I would say nasty.
Really? In what regard?
Just in the I don't want to speak ill somebody else's work.
Oh no, it's you don't have to name.
But since I'm punching up,
right, that is true. Yes.
So that Roderick Hart, who is an eminent rhetorical scholar in the 70s, wrote an article called "Unquiet Desperation," arguing more or less that atheism as a social movement had failed, and that failure had created a series of negative characteristics in atheist rhetoric, anger and black and white thinking, and I'd have to go to my notes to find the full list, but I thought this is really infected with a very negative viewpoint towards this group of people, and it's fine to have a negative viewpoint toward a group of people if you're willing to justify it, but I wanted to see, well, let's kind of go easy and just see what's going on here and what we can learn from it. But I wonder, as a researcher, whether our current environment will reward a scholarship that looks disparate, that looks like, you know, that is in different areas. That's a thing to think about when you're in graduate school.
Yeah. Yeah, no, absolutely.
I like studying lots of different things. I think it's really fun and fascinating. I think it makes for better research, but it does not make for faster research.
Certainly.
I can say that.
Well, it probably takes you back to coursework a little bit. I mean, that's what we miss about coursework, is being able to like do one paper on this controversy we're interested in, and
right.
another paper on this controversy,
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, even I know that it's been kind of strange to because I myself study food justice activism and advocacy, so hunger movements essentially. But I also have these kind of subsidiary interests in again doing kind of critical analyses of men's rights activist discourses online, and
how fascinating!
Yeah, and it's always, I mean, in addition, it's kind of you can find a thread, that weaves all of these together, whether or not it's a kind of what is it exactly that helps people constitute a group identity rhetorically. That serves this sort of cohesive function. How do you develop a sort of lexicon for how quote unquote we talk to one another, and how we oftentimes to the exclusion of others, and how do we use that kind of identity to mobilize people to actually to paraphrase you from earlier, how do we use that to those kind of linguistic moves to call for action? How do we use it to get something done? And so, yeah, I mean, I really appreciate that about your work and the way that you're describing it as, finding this sort of common, thing that's of very, real rhetorical importance, and, tracing it as it, is kind of occurring in all these different contexts and all these different domains. I think that can be really powerful.
I want to know how people come to know who other people are. Not in an interpersonal way, but in a categorical way, and how that changes. And I'm with you, Alex. I want to look at some of the really troubling stuff, as well as some of the stuff we would prefer to be reading.
Right.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's a pretty good summation of a lot of the reasons why not only did we get into the field, but also why we wanted to do something like this as a podcast, and the sort of continuation of the legacy of the Silver Tongue in the form of Reverb.
Boy, legacy is a generous word.
Well, I mean, we wouldn't be doing it if we didn't believe in the value of what you started.
Exactly.
Well, I wish you well, and I hope that you enjoy great success and satisfaction in your efforts. And I hope that you will continue to develop a nuanced view of what an engaged citizen looks like.
Fantastic.
We didn't figure it out, but maybe you will get closer.
We're gonna at least continue the conversation.
Give it the old college try.
Yeah, so to speak.
All right.
Well, Doug Cloud, thank you so much for being with us. This was such an enlightening conversation. Is there anything that you'd like to plug, or any ways that our listeners can find you? Do you have a Twitter handle that we can plug here?
I do not tweet regularly.
That's fine.
Here's the social media thing. I'm not a big social media guy. You can find me on academia.edu.
Great.
I keep a repository of my work there. That would be the easiest way to do it.
Excellent. All right. Well, you can find all of his work there, as well as in many different rhetoric publications as well. Doug Cloud, thank you again so much for being with us.
Thanks, Doug.
It's my distinct pleasure.
All right. Take care. We'll talk to you later.
To conclude today's episode, we give you a portion of a conversation we had with two of the other Reverb editorial team members, Anna Cook and Ryan Mitchell. Our conversation began by addressing the question, why should anyone listen to this podcast?
And the discussion brought us to the topic of the relations between the humanities and STEM fields, which is the portion that we're including here.
No, I mean, I'm not sure that I can articulate this that well, so I'm sort of, I'm trying to think, what do the humanities do for me? I have, I guess, sort of a philosophical commitment to the idea that, human meaning exists inside of human sort of systems, right? So, and it's a sort of speciesist perspective on this. And so I'm thinking about things like philosophy and history and the ways that things like narratives and myths and frameworks for conceptualizing meaning that are not easily quantified, that don't necessarily manifest themselves well inside of like micro trends, that can't be sort of like reduced easily, that don't show up because we don't have, you know, a record inside of human history that we have, you know, like I'm free associating in not even sort of a logical way, but sort of like a, you know, Jungian archetypal unconscious kind of stuff. Like this idea, I mean, I try, you know, like when my students start to like talk about how they're having problems with their parents, and I talk about sort of like the Jungian archetype of the hero, and I'm like, this is a thing that many of us go through, like when you know, you have to like confront your father, and that's just like a thing that happens in you, right? So there's all sorts of like ways of making meaning that the humanities understand, right? That are powerful, that are, you know, like stories, things that connect us to each other, that connect us to communities, that connect us in a sort of deep, rich sense, that just don't, you know, they can't be quantified, that you know, it's hard to sort of conceptualize the ways that they guide our actions, but are like tremendously meaning, like I just want to be like, they're so meaningful, but like that is what the humanities have been cultivating and studying and understanding and sort of like offering for a long time, and it saddens, you know, so like in relation to the political, like those things are there, but to me those are also sort of like resources for the average citizen to kind of like understand themselves as a person in a different way from, you know, whatever kind of, you know, like I have all this health data on my phone that tells me that I am, you know, somebody who walks this many steps a day. Like those things are really important too, you know, or ways of conceptualizing yourself in relation to a human experience that aren't just about explaining the socio-political landscape, but also sort of like a recentering of like, this is not the only way that you can conceptualize like your life, your relationship to life world, your life goals, your, you know, place in the universe. Like, the humanities do that, you know?
And I also think that, like, what you're saying, Anna, I think resonates so much in terms of this propagandistic strategies behind politics that are rooted in statistics.
Right.
So the idea that what I hear you saying is that identities are forged through historical and contemporary narratives of self that are portable across individuals, across times in certain regards. However, when we have kind of a mass culture that people feel completely alienated in their identities because of the representations of politics or sexual minoritarian identities, whatever, there becomes this question of, do a heavy reliance on statistical mappings actually work toward dominant hegemonic political systems? I mean, there was this wonderful, and I cannot remember the author, so you're going to have to put this in the notes or something like that at the end, but this author writes this it's a rhetorical author, writes this wonderful piece about the rhetorical effects of red state, blue state mapping.
Oh, yeah.
Do you remember what I'm talking about?
I do. I don't
you know what
remember
I'm
the
talking
author.
about.
Yeah.
Beyond the borders of red and blue states, Google Maps is a site of rhetorical invention in the 2008 presidential election by Amber Davison, Rhetoric and Public Affairs, 2011.
And about how what it does is an alienating apparatus. And so when people see, if you were, I mean, it works both ways. If you are a liberal or if you are a conservative in a state that does not match your identity, you don't go vote because you don't feel like you have a political voice. So at the same time that statistical data is somehow trying to quantify what the public opinion is, heavy quotations around public opinion, what it's fundamentally doing is isolating people from a particular type of identity that they may or may not want to express at a particular moment. And so I think that what it does is it anesthetizes or paralyzes any type of dissidence at a maybe grassroots local level because people don't feel like there's anyone around them. Yeah. But I wanted to say that, I mean, one of the economic Nobel laureate the Nobel Prize winner for economics was Richard Thaler, who was famous for bringing in behavioral economics, which is fundamentally what I view as being a humanities-infused approach to economics, which embraces human human variation in behavior, illogical structures of decision making, and I think that what we're seeing is that those have incredible purchase analytically, and they have a lot of potential explanatory value that working on the assumption that there is some kind of encoded logical human relationship that is programmed into us, we don't have.
Yeah.
And this speaks to what Anna was bringing up earlier about the mind-body distinction, right? So, like, the idea that there can be, that fundamentally the idea of big data is trying to get at the mind versus the body, right? Because the mind is always statistical and the body is always emotional. And so the humanities pushes against those easy dichotomies.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know if I'm comfortable with like associating the mathematical with the dominant and the non-mathematical with, the subaltern. I think I'm not necessarily saying anyone directly asserted that, but I was sort of hearing it, and I think that.
Can you explain what you mean?
So what I mean is that I think there's a tendency to associate kind of like non-mathematical, more humanistic, emotional, embodied ways of identifying or ways of thinking and conceptualizing issues or ideas, associating that with a subalternity, and associating a more mathematical, rationalistic, cerebral approach with a more dominant identity. And I think that's violated all the time, that assumption. And also,
but of course,
I think it kind of assumes that like subalterns can't win on the playing field of rationality and statistics and cerebral engagement with issues, and I don't think that's true.
No, and I don't think any of us were positioning that kind of knowledge as such. I mean, if I was using the term dominant or trying to positioning like STEM fields that way, it's just because they get more money than we do. I mean, there's just kind of a bitterness factor of that seems to be privileged more. Again, that's a human choice that we should say too. That those kinds of knowledges have been framed that way, the way that Calvin is describing them, that I think we do want to push against in a really major way. Like you can't have one without the other. You can't be purely rational without having that kind of
What I would say is that the structure of language, for instance, is a system that tends to be relatively self-contained and rationalistic and like very, very strictly structured, and that's something that we cannot engage rhetorically without at least using as a resource. And so I would submit that there's no way of avoiding these kind of like statistical, mathematical, rationalistic like sides of the human experience. And I think that we wouldn't be good humanists if we like completely rejected that.
Right, and I agree with you, Calvin. Like I don't, I think our department is a great example of a place where like if somehow we were drawing some kind of weird map and we put rhetoric inside of the alogical or rationalistic, like some of our faculty's head would pop off because they're like tremendous at logic and rationalism and argument, and they understand like rationality and rational argument and the way that those things function both on a philosophical and also sort of on a like structural level much better than people who might necessarily like make arguments that are premised on the way that rationality functions, right? Like they get rationality, they study rationality, right? And we make quantitative arguments, like I make quantitative arguments in my own work, right?
Exactly.
Like to sort of like draw, sort of hard battle lines between ways of making knowledge and sort of like probabilistic thinking or quantitative thinking or even sort of empirical methods versus like humanistic analytic methods is like problematic, and that's kind of I think what I hear you kind of pushing against. I mean, I also, but I do think that for me, what is kind of more the heart of the issue to some degree is the kind of positive correlation between like technical progress that tends to come out of STEM, like technological progress, engineering progress, that tends to come out of STEM innovative fields, and like the sort of like capitalist idea of human progress as like positively correlating with like economic growth, certain modes of dominance, sorts of modes of reproduction, right? So it's not this sort of like way of making knowledge as much it is the sort of like way that knowledge making becomes sort of like sucked into like larger economic systems and social systems and, you know, all those other things, right? It's not like I love empiricism, and thank God there are people who know what antibiotics are and who study it, you know? I love them and I want them to keep getting funding.
Yes. And I think we should love computer science and love robotics because because, you know, hacktivists are computer scientists and there could be, you know, we could be building robots that are equalizing the you know, means of production.
But I think that I'm going to push back against this a little bit, because I think that there's a difference between wanting to have and utilize the technological affordances that are present in a moment for all the potential they can have. But there is, in the arguments we're making, still a hierarchy that's set up between a logical empirical approach and one that's rooted in a more kind of experiential lived experience. And so I think that I understand what Calvin has said.
Do you mean in the arguments we're making here today?
Yeah. And I think that what I hear you saying, Calvin, in terms of I think that you're right in saying that there's often that kind of assumption that subaltern communities aren't really good at making rationalist arguments. And that we can see there's a heavy appeal to emotion, as we were talking about earlier in the night, with kind of like identitarian white nationalists playing into victim politics. However, I think that what we are seeing increasingly is that victim narrative is being cushioned inside of really unsophisticated readings of different types of biological theory. So while they might be coming from a space of emotion or affect, what they're trying to do is gain entrance into a quote-unquote empirically solvable discourse. And they're trying to like the Google memo is a perfect example, right? So the guy's citing different types of scientific work to show that women are somehow not actually productive in STEM fields. And so what it has to do with is who are the sources that we're citing? Who are the people that we're working with to validate our claims? I think that what I'm arguing for is not so much that we need to push against the idea that there needs to be vetting or robust work in any type of endeavor at all. And I'm not anti-progress technologically or mathematically, but what I'm anti is the idea that there needs to be somehow it needs to be reduced to a rigorous, quote-unquote, rational metric of vetting. And I think that this is such a difficult way to talk about it, and it shows kind of what you were saying about the rigidity of language, is that obviously language changes all the time, and the things that words come to mean are malleable, but in the current moment when we're using them, the ways that we talk about facticity, even just the word facticity assumes that it's verifiable. The way we talk about things that we feel to be true or have any type of currency are rooted in a rationalist perspective, and that's a hegemony. I think that's a hegemony.
Yeah, and I think that's a really useful way to think about, again, how I'm conceptualizing what this podcast and our sort of project and as scholars could be useful for us to, again, we're drawing on, you know, Antonio Gramsci's term of hegemony here, of this sort of, you know, sort of ruling ideas or, you know, thoughts or ideology of the day. You know, we're trying to generate a broader kind of consent for a different hegemony.
But I also want to say to Anna though too, because I agree with Anna. Like, I'm not trying to argue that there's not an ontological real, like a certainty, because antibiotics work, like, and they're great and they're fantastic. Robots have allowed us to do tremendous things, and these things are real. Like, I think that
and robots don't need to blow up little kids. They could be doing great things. Exactly. That's the point I was trying to make earlier.
Well, yeah, and that's also to this idea that all the things that technology is being used for, these are made up of human choices. You know, these are human systems. You know, like we can't understand STEM without understanding the humanities.
Exactly.
I would contest.
Our
show was produced today by Calvin Pollock and Alex Helberg, with editing done by Calvin. Reverb is a production of English graduate students at Carnegie Mellon University. Alex Helberg is our editor-in-chief. Calvin Pollock is our podcast editor. Our web editor is Anna Cook. Our content editor is Derek Handley. And our PR and social media team is Ryan Mitchell and Audrey Strom. Thanks for tuning in.